As our survey of major concepts in political philosophy demonstrated, the theory and practices of the state have been a central concern for political thinkers. Empirical political science also focuses on the state as a core subject of inquiry. There is an obvious reason for this. States have long been associated with political power, from the Neolithic Revolution and the emergence of urban civilizations to the 19th and 20th century peaks of high modernism that brought the entire world under the rule of states. But what is the state? The answer, and this might not surprise you, is complicated. On the one hand, political science employs long standing and well tested definitions of the state and its most common powers. On the other hand, states have manifested and developed their powers in breathtaking variety among societies that have very different assumptions regarding the role and function of the state. We'll necessarily emphasize some aspects of the state at the expense of others, but what we'll try to focus on are those forms of state action that have most decisively shaped contemporary political reality. First, we need to clarify some vocabulary. In this class, when we talk about the state, we'll almost always be referring to it as a generic term for institutions of government. This is not the same thing as referring to the 50 American states that make up the federal union. The state of New York is a state in the generic sense, with many powers over its citizens, but it is also subject to the laws of the federal government, which itself represents the overall American state in the general political scientific sense of the word. So we can easily define the presidency, the Congress, and the judiciary as the chief organs of the American state, even though they share some powers with 50 separate regional governments. We are interested in what Machiavelli called lo Stato, the integral territory over which a prince aspires to wield power. A central feature of the state, as Hobbes relentlessly reminds us, is sovereignty, the absolute authority to make binding laws for a certain people occupying a certain space. Because the enforcement of sovereignty necessarily requires violence, the state is also a fundamentally coercive institution, the coldest of all cold monsters, according to Nietzsche. But for a century, the most commonly employed definition of the state has been the one offered by Max Weber. Weber was one of the founders of modern social science. A German academic who made decisive contributions to sociology and political science, Weber's theories of society are often studied in contrast to Karl Marx's interpretations of the same social phenomenon. Weber argued against a common trend in Marxist thought that sought to reduce all cultural and ideological forms of life as expressions of underlying economic facts. Weber portrayed a more complex interaction between independent but intertwined economic, cultural, and political factors that determined the evolution of modern societies. In one of his most famous works, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, he advanced a famous hypothesis that linked certain unique aspects of Protestant cultural life to the early development and success of capitalist economics, compared to predominantly Catholic, Orthodox, or Muslim societies. In late 1918, Weber gave a series of lectures on the meaning of politics at the University of Munich. The circumstances were bleak. Germany was reeling from the twin traumas of defeat in the First World War and a left-wing revolution that toppled the monarchy and appeared to be following the example of the victorious Bolsheviks in neighboring Russia. In these lectures, Weber references the Russian Revolution and the pitiless efforts by the Bolshevik regime to build states from the ruins of the old order. New states were popping up all over Europe in the wake of World War I. The German, Russian, Austrian, and Turkish empires were ruined in the war, and successor states waged brutal little conflicts to impose order in a sudden vacuum. Periods of intermingled state collapse and foundation necessarily call attention to basic definitions. Whether it's an absolutist monarchy, a liberal republic, or a revolutionary workers' council, what features do all states share? Weber focuses on their coercive, sovereign power, the power to enforce laws backed with guns. The more established a state is, the longer it has wielded authority on the basis of broad legitimacy, the less obvious this coercive foundation is. Indeed, the less a state needs to bare its teeth, the more support it will likely enjoy. But in periods of conflict and chaos like 1918, the state acts openly on the basis of violent coercion, and its other qualities take a back seat to military necessity. Weber says the state is a governing organization that successfully upholds a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a defined territory. That's it. That's the definition. According to Weber, no matter what else a state does or claims to do, it's no state if it can't fulfill this core function. You know you are living under the authority of a state when it is clear to everyone just who is allowed to use violence and who is not. When there is a publicly recognized body of men who are authorized to kill on behalf of the government, you know you are living under state power. The state claims and enforces an exclusive right to the just use of violence. Let's say you were wronged by someone, kill them in response, and are put on trial for that act. You're not really being tried for a violation of moral precepts against killing. You are being put on trial because you used a power that did not belong to you. All states have some form of a criminal justice system because all states must provide a forum for the exercise of legitimate violence. For the same reason, all states claim the exclusive right to raise armies. States use coercion to suppress cycles of violence among private parties, for example, feuds and vendettas between armed groups. Also, by publicly punishing convicted criminals, the state demonstrates its own superior violence, embedded in a system that claims to serve impartial justice. This is one reason why, for most of recorded history, public executions were popular mass gatherings, whose festive elements reinforced the demonstration of the awful power of the sovereign state. By suppressing private violence and monopolizing public violence, states claim the authority to impose binding laws. The reach of that law is only as strong as the state's power to enforce it. Hence, all states are bounded. They lay claim to a specific piece of territory, the size of which typically corresponds to the state's ability to defend it. State power, once established, tends to grow and push against limits. For example, dangerous neighbors might compel nervous rulers to expand their military, which in turn requires greater extractions of resources and manpower from society. States must then invest in newer, more efficient forms of exploiting society for its own ends. This may spark resistance that calls into question the state's authority, inviting challenges within the borders of the state itself. The historical artifacts of this resistance appear in the variety of state forms we see today. States that historically dealt with serious internal resistance to their rule tend to be states that today have more local autonomy and powerful representative institutions, the outcome of long struggles between rulers and ruled. Historically, states have been fragile creations, prone to periods of contraction and decay. But the basic logic of state expansion is always present. This is why world history is full of cycles of state development and collapse. We just so happen to live in a period that takes state power for granted. In the grand scheme of human existence, this kind of pervasive, long-term state power is relatively new. A notable exception to this pattern is China, which over the past 2,000 years pioneered forms of intensive state power that outlasted virtually all of its contemporaries. But the modern state, which developed into the nation states that dominate the world today, originated in early modern Europe. It was this model of the state that Weber was discussing, which remains standard in the social science. The Tilly and Mann articles we are reading emphasize the most salient aspects of the modern state for modern political science. Tilly compares the state to an organized crime racket to help us more immediately confront the core business of the state, which typically veils itself behind any number of rationalizations and justifications for the application of violence. Tilly's method is historical. He traces the evolution of European states since the late Middle Ages and identifies common themes and trends. In each case, he finds that expanding states engaged in two irreplaceable practices. First, states pacified the territories under their control, suppressing violence among their own subjects and establishing the fact of the state's domination. Second, states develop techniques to more efficiently extract the resources they need. Tax collectors and recruiting parties seized crops, cash, and conscripts. Successful states excelled at these practices and could rely on having the money and guns necessary to fight foreign states or internal enemies. Unsuccessful states failed to either sustainably finance or arm themselves, and the price of failure was defeat and incorporation into rival states. We can easily think of Machiavelli's advice to princes in this context, but Tilly says we should just as readily think of the mafia or a drug cartel. Organized crime, too, seeks to control territory that it can exploit. In situations where rival gangs compete over territory, the strongest players seek to impose order on their own terms, since internal violence is bad for business. A feared and unchallenged criminal organization has a much easier time feeding off of the territory it controls. Consider the protection racket. Let's say you're a shop owner, a little grocery, or a bodega. One day, a couple of tough guys show up and say that you've got a nice store, be a shame if something happened to it. The price of keeping it safe is $1,000 a week, deliverable to these same two guys every Friday. Now, maybe these guys will keep rival gangs from robbing you or burning down your store. But you can bet that without that $1,000 payment, these two guys will come back with baseball bats and a can of gasoline. Tilly says, well, how is the state any different? After all, U.S. taxpayers finance the military to the tune of $800 billion a year. Maybe that military does keep us and our freedoms safe, but you're not in a position to decline that protection and withhold your money. If you don't pay your taxes, the IRS might not burn down your house, but if they seize it and sell it to get the money they're owed, what's the difference? Also, like organized crime, the successful state knows when to use the stick and when to use the carrot. Peasants and minor nobles could be violently repressed, while powerful landowners, merchants, and mercenaries were more likely to be negotiated with or co-opted. Since ambitious states were in chronic need of cash and credit, they entered into arrangements with capitalist magnates who financed the state in exchange for protection of their trade routes and profits. This is not some relic of the past either. During the so-called Banana Wars of the early 20th century, the U.S. Marine Corps invaded several Central American republics in order to impose a system favorable to the United Fruit Company, an American firm that controlled fruit production in the region and relied on American military muscle to keep local governments quiet and the labor force in line. This is the source of the phrase banana republic, which denotes a state that is so weak and unable to uphold its central functions that it invites foreign intervention and exploitation. The American commanding officer of these banana wars, General Smedley Butler, described his job as serving as hired muscle for capitalism. This kind of state power, the direct application of violence, is what Mann would refer to as despotic power. This is state violence in its most direct form, the oldest kind of state action. But historically, despotic power has been limited. It can be concentrated and all-powerful in the centers of state power, but limited technology and communications means that even powerful states could not reliably extend their range. The modern state, which can make use of all kinds of technological assistance, strives to develop infrastructural power. This refers to the state's power to penetrate different aspects of social life and exercise its power in fuller but more subtle ways than usual. Whether it's the IRS automatically withholding taxes from your paycheck or the NSA scooping up internet metadata, the modern state has a whole battery of tactics at its command that allows it to extract the resources it needs while minimizing direct coercive force. Today, the idea that the nation-state is the normal method for peoples to organize themselves politically remains standard. But we should never forget how historically new this consensus is and how unlikely it is to remain the standard throughout a perilous 21st century.